In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the largest military invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa was not just a war, it was meant to be annihilation. Millions of German soldiers surged eastward into Soviet territory, confident they would crush the Red Army before winter ever became a concern. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Russia. The skies buzzed with Luftwaffe squadrons, while panzer divisions sliced through the Soviet lines like a knife through paper. Cities fell, entire armies collapsed. It was blitzkrieg perfected, fast, brutal, unstoppable. But by late September, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the skies grayer, the rains began. Endless, unforgiving autumn rain turned the roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles stalled, supplies backed up. Speed, Germany's greatest weapon, was fading. The Germans had a name for it, Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season. Even tanks couldn't move. Horses were brought in to haul artillery. Soldiers, once proud and sharp, now trudged ankle-deep in mud, exhausted and freezing. The Eastern Front was grinding to a halt. And then came the cold, not the crisp chill of a European winter, but a brutal, biting freeze that shattered steel and numbed souls. By November, temperatures had dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines cracked. Guns refused to fire. Frostbite spread like wildfire. The German High Command had not prepared for this. Troops wore summer uniforms, with only thin coats to shield them from the Russian frost. They tore curtains from village houses, wrapped themselves in newspapers, and burned anything they could find, just to stay alive through the night. Still, Hitler insisted on pushing toward Moscow. The capital was close, within reach. German soldiers could see the city in the distance. But what they didn't see was the trap being laid. Soviet reinforcements from Siberia, battle-hardened, cold-trained, were silently arriving. On December 5th, the trap was sprung. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. Trains brought in fresh divisions. T-34 tanks roared through the snow. German forces, frozen and stretched thin, were overwhelmed. The mighty Wehrmacht retreated, backward for the first time. The myth of Nazi invincibility cracked in the snow outside Moscow. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were not attacking, but running. Christmas would not be celebrated in Moscow. It would be spent in trenches, in the frost, in fear. And as the snow fell over the blood-stained fields, it became clear. Blitzkrieg had failed, not because of Soviet numbers or strategy, but because of something more ancient, something no army could conquer: the Russian winter. As German forces stalled outside Moscow, a hidden force was awakening far to the east. In the icy shadows of Siberia, elite divisions trained for Arctic warfare stood at attention. Their boots had marched through snow their entire lives. Their uniforms were thick, white, and built for survival. They were Stalin's last card, and perhaps his most lethal. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The Siberian divisions were hand-picked, born from the cold, forged by survival. Ski troops moved like shadows across the snow. Sharpshooters could pick off enemies hidden beneath camouflage. While the Germans shivered, the Siberians thrived. Until now, Stalin had hesitated to move these men west. Japan threatened from the east. But Soviet spies confirmed what Stalin needed to hear: Japan would not attack. With that, He gave the order. Train after train roared westward, packed with silent warriors of the cold. As the Germans dug into their frozen trenches, they heard a strange sound, skis, like whispers of death gliding through the snow. Before they could react, Siberian troops were among them, fast, precise, deadly. Entire outposts vanished in a night. The Soviets knew the terrain. They struck at night, in blizzards, when German equipment failed and spirits broke. T-34 tanks rumbled behind waves of white-clad infantry. Unlike the Germans, the Soviets had the winter on their side. For them, the snow was not a curse, it was camouflage. German commanders were stunned. They had expected the Soviets to retreat, not to strike back, and not with such cold-blooded fury. Reports flooded in of brutal ambushes, coordinated assaults, and terrifying efficiency. The legend of the Siberian ghosts was born. By late December, German lines near Moscow began to crumble. Supply routes were cut, entire divisions isolated. The Nazis, who once boasted of reaching Moscow by Christmas, now begged for reinforcements. But there were none to send. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Hitler refused to authorize a full retreat. He demanded they hold every inch of ground, no matter the cost. The result was a massacre. Thousands of German troops froze in their positions, trapped between Stalin's fury and Hitler's stubbornness. And yet, it was more than just bullets or tanks that undid the German war machine. It was a force of nature embodied in men who called the cold their home. The Siberian divisions were not just soldiers. They were the embodiment of a land that would never surrender. In the end, it wasn't Moscow that defeated the Wehrmacht. It was the snow, the silence, the Siberian ghosts that emerged from the frost and vanished just as swiftly into the blizzard. By January 1942, the dream of a quick victory in the East was dead. The German army, once so sure of triumph, was now fighting for survival. The retreat from Moscow was not a tactical maneuver. It was a desperate scramble through snow, mud, and blood. Wounded soldiers were loaded onto makeshift sleds. Many would not survive the journey. Entire regiments moved like shadows through white forests, constantly harassed by Soviet partisans and freezing winds. It wasn't just the enemy that hunted them. It was the land itself. Behind them, villages they had once occupied were reclaimed by the Red Army. Burned-out tanks stood as frozen tombs in the snow. Horses lay dead, frozen mid-stride. The land was littered with the wreckage of a failed ambition. Supply lines had collapsed. Food was scarce, ammunition scarcer. The same soldiers who once marched confidently into Russia now tore apart trees for firewood and ate raw potatoes dug from the frozen ground. Some even turned on each other for survival. The Soviet pursuit was relentless. Stalin ordered no rest, no mercy. Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Snipers picked off stragglers. T-34s rolled over thin ice and into fleeing German columns. For every mile the Germans retreated, they paid in lives. In desperation, some German officers disobeyed orders and fell back to more defensible positions. Others stayed, frozen in loyalty or in fear of Hitler's wrath. Some divisions simply disappeared, swallowed by the Russian winter and the advancing Soviet tide. Yet even in retreat, the Germans fought with grim discipline. They laid mines, set traps, and ambushed their pursuers when they could. The Eastern Front was a graveyard, but not a quiet one. Every step backward was soaked in resistance. By February, the German front had stabilized, but at a terrible cost. Over 500,000 casualties. The myth of blitzkrieg was shattered. For the first time, Hitler had been forced to face the possibility that this war might not be won with speed alone. In Berlin, the mood shifted. The victories of 1939 and 1940 felt like distant memories. Propaganda could not hide the truth. Germany had bled in the snow. And the worst part? The Eastern War was only beginning. Operation Barbarossa had not just failed, it had awakened a sleeping giant. And that giant, fueled by vengeance, frost, and fury, was now marching west. In the chaos of retreat, not every sound was gunfire. In between shelling and frostbite, soldiers wrote letters. Some begged to come home. Others lied, saying everything was fine. A few admitted the truth, that they might not survive the week. "Mother," one wrote, "my hands are black from the cold. I've seen comrades freeze upright like statues. We are not soldiers anymore. We are ghosts dragging rifles through hell." Mail delivery had become sporadic. Letters were carried by foot, smuggled through ruins, or never sent at all. But the act of writing grounded them. It gave meaning to madness. Each sentence was a lifeline thrown across thousands of miles to a world untouched by snow and blood. One officer confessed in his letter that he no longer believed in the war. "We were told we'd be welcomed as liberators. Instead, we found hate, and we deserved it." His words would never reach Berlin. His body was found weeks later, frozen beside a burnt-out truck. Soviet soldiers wrote too. Their letters often mixed rage with hope. "Tell our children," one Red Army sniper wrote, "that we fight for their sunrise. We sleep in the snow so they may dream in peace." Sometimes German and Soviet letters would be found on the same battlefield, frozen in the hands of men who once lived miles apart, now sharing the same white grave. Back home, families clutched these letters like relics. Wives, mothers, children, reading the last words of men who were already gone. Some letters arrived months too late. Others were censored beyond recognition. But the silence they filled was louder than any newsreel. For both sides, the Eastern Front was more than just lines on a map. It was a soul-crushing, body-breaking abyss. One where bullets could kill a man, but cold could erase him completely. As the war raged on, the letters became fewer, not because there was less to say, but because fewer hands remained to write them. These weren't stories of strategy or victory. They were whispers from the edge of existence. Humanity scratched onto paper, torn, frozen, and forgotten in the snow. And though the war would continue, those pages remain, a testimony not to generals or borders, but to the fragile, burning spark of human life in the coldest corner of the world. By late summer 1942, Hitler turned his gaze south, to the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus and the symbolic city on the Volga, Stalingrad. Taking it would strike a blow to Stalin's pride and cripple Soviet morale. But instead of victory, Germany would find its breaking point. The assault began with thunderous aerial bombardment. Stalingrad, once an industrial hub, was reduced to a skeleton of rubble. But rubble fights back. Soviet troops turned every building into a fortress, every basement into a bunker. It became a war of rats. Snipers lurked behind statues. Machine guns were hidden under collapsed staircases. Entire units died just to take one floor of a single factory. And when night fell, the dead were dragged away quietly so the next wave could take their place. Food vanished, water froze. Soldiers sucked on buttons to stimulate saliva. Some boiled leather belts into soup. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, became whispered reality. Survival blurred the line between man and animal. The Germans called in reinforcements, but Stalin had already vowed, not one step back. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, many shot before they touched land. Yet they came, again and again, as if the river itself bled soldiers. Then winter struck again, but this time it didn't just slow the Germans, it trapped them. Operation Uranus, Stalin's brutal counterattack, encircled the entire Sixth Army. A whole German force, over 250,000 strong, was cut off. Hitler ordered them to hold. Surrender is forbidden. Supplies had to be flown in, but too many planes were shot down, too many crates dropped in the wrong places. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep up. Hunger did what bullets couldn't. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was no longer an army. It was a graveyard of men in uniform. When Field Marshal Paulus finally surrendered, against Hitler's orders, it marked the first time in the war that a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Of the 250,000 German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would ever return home. The rest remained, frozen, starved, obliterated, or lost to history. Stalingrad wasn't just a defeat, it was a reckoning, a symbol that the Nazi war machine could bleed and would never again move forward without remembering the ghosts it left behind on the banks of the Volga. In the winter of 1943, German radios still blasted out propaganda, songs of glory, maps with arrows always pointing forward. But inside Berlin's bunkers, the truth echoed louder than any anthem. The tide had turned, and the Reich was bleeding out. Reports from Stalingrad had been sanitized. The Sixth Army is holding, they claimed. But wives knew better. The letters stopped. The uniforms never came home, and the silence screamed louder than Goebbels' broadcasts. Factories in the heart of Germany began to slow. Skilled workers were gone, dead, captured, or now children in uniforms too big for their shoulders. Women forged bullets while bombs fell overhead. The sky above Berlin, once clear, now growled with Allied engines. Hitler's inner circle fractured. The Führer became more paranoid, more detached. Orders were irrational. Troops were told to hold positions without food or ammunition. Dissent was punishable by death, but obedience meant the same fate. The Eastern Front cracked open like a shell. Soviet forces, now better trained, better armed, and fueled by vengeance, pushed westward with terrifying momentum. Each town they reclaimed revealed horrors: mass graves, burning villages, children hiding in wells. As panic spread, Berliners dug deeper. Subway tunnels turned into hospitals, schools, even cemeteries. Children were born underground while the world above disintegrated. And yet hope lingered, fragile, delusional, human. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I no longer fight for victory. I fight because I don't know what else to do." That entry ended abruptly. The rest of the pages were blank. In a desperate move, the Nazis deployed teenage soldiers and elderly men to the front. Volkssturm units, poorly trained, poorly armed, stood against seasoned Soviet tank divisions. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. By early 1945, Berlin was surrounded, but the city had already fallen long before the Red Army arrived. It collapsed in the minds of its people, in the eyes of its children, in the trembling hands of mothers stitching uniforms for ghosts. And yet Hitler still believed in victory. Even as the city crumbled, he clutched a map of Europe that no longer existed, issuing commands to divisions that no longer lived. April 1945. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich now stood hollow, broken and burning. Soviet artillery had encircled Berlin. Every sunrise came with a fresh rain of fire. Every sunset lit up the ruins like a funeral pyre. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler held meetings with ghosts. Maps lay across his desk, arrows, movements, strategies, but most of those divisions were already gone. He spoke of victory, but even his generals knew it was over. Above ground, civilians and soldiers alike braced for the end. Women carried rifles. Children dragged buckets of water through fire-ravaged streets. The SS patrolled with orders: shoot anyone who speaks of surrender. But in whispers, even they wondered what death would look like. The Soviets advanced street by street, house by house. Fighting in Berlin was personal. Every soldier knew someone who had died in a Nazi camp, in a village, under an air raid. They didn't just want to win. They wanted Berlin to remember. Flamethrowers cleared buildings. Tank shells cracked open bunkers. Snipers took aim through church steeples. The city became a graveyard built on another graveyard. The smell of smoke and blood hung in the air, thicker than the fog. Inside his bunker, Hitler married Eva Braun. Less than 48 hours later, they were both dead, poison and a bullet. Goebbels followed, killing his 6 children first. One by one, the architects of the Reich vanished into the dirt. On May 2nd, the red flag was raised over the Reichstag. Berlin was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a pile of ashes soaked in silence. The surviving Germans emerged from bunkers with hollow eyes and shaking hands, greeted not with mercy, but with reality. Over 300,000 civilians were dead, thousands more injured or missing. The city was split, carved up like a prize. The world had won the war, but lost something else along the way. The fall of Berlin was not just an end. It was a warning, a reminder of what happens when hate becomes law, when truth is silenced, and when one man's vision is allowed to eclipse humanity itself.